chiming in. So welcome everyone. My name is Brett Thielen. I'm the science director with the Harris Center for Conservation Education. I also have my colleagues Karen Seaver here. You want to chime in, Karen, and say hi?
Hey, thanks for coming tonight. So great to see so many amphibian loving folk. I'm one of them. I work at the Harris Center as a staff ecologist, and I also teach at Keene State. So shout out to all the see a bunch of Keeners out there. And this will be my third season being directly involved with migration. So thanks for coming.
And Susie Spickel, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Susie Spickel, the Community Programs Director at the Harris Center and one of the naturalists here. And I love amphibians and reptiles, and I love this project so much. It just feels like spring doesn't happen until this happens, or I guess that's really true, right?
That is true. That is absolutely true. So with that, I think we probably have some new folks who are new to the Harris Center tonight. So as I welcome you, I will also introduce you to who we are. The Harris Center for Conservation Education, we're based in the Monadnock region of Southwest New Hampshire. We're a land trust and environmental education center, and we help people fall in love with the natural world through land protection, conservation research, including community science projects like the one you're going to learn about tonight, and education for all ages. So anyone who is local to the Monadnock region, we've protected more than 24,000 acres of land from development. Much of that is open for hiking, birding, salamander searching, and other recreation. Coordinate conservation research on those protected lands and throughout the region through projects like the one you're going to hear about tonight. And at the heart of everything we do is education for all ages, from babies in backpacks to residents of retirement communities and all points in between. And we've got a really incredible calendar of events coming up for you this spring. So if you are a Harris Center supporter, I always like to thank you for making this all possible. And if you're new to us, I really encourage you to check us out at harriscenter.org. That's also going to be a really great resource for all things salamander in the coming months. So with that, I'm going to start to share my screen here, and we will get started. So I'm really excited that you're all here tonight. As I said, my name's Brett Thielen. I'm the science director here at the Harris Center, and I've been coordinating our Salamander Crossing Brigade project. I think this will be my 16th season on the roads. And it's exciting every year. So I'm really glad that you're here to learn about it. And I'd like to encourage you to think about tonight as an invitation to what, in my opinion, is one of the most magical times of year, and also a time of year when a natural phenomenon that many of us don't have the opportunity to experience because it happens on rainy nights when we might be tucked away inside. So this is your invitation to experience the magic of what we call Big Night. And just an outline of what we're going to be covering tonight. The first thing is we're going to talk about the spring amphibian migration. What is it? When does it happen? Then we're going to talk about how to identify the different species that you might encounter out and about on migration nights. We're going to talk about why amphibians matter, because even if you decide after this that you don't really want to go out in a 45-degree rain, I hope that you'll still come away from this talk with an appreciation for amphibians and as an advocate for amphibians in your community. So it's important to think about why they matter beyond their own just intrinsic value as living beings. I'm going to talk about how the crossing brigades work and how you can be involved if you want to be. Tips for finding new crossings. This is especially for those of you who don't live in the Monadnock region that might want to get this going where you live. How can you get started? I'm going to talk a little bit about a special project that we have at a few of our sites here to document the unique spot patterns on spotted salamanders. And then we'll wrap up with some of the successes from this project so you can see what your participation can lead to for amphibian conservation. Okay, so first and foremost, we're here to learn about the amphibian migration. And really at the center of this is a myth that environmental educators love to tell. And it goes something like this. After a long, snowy, icy winter, the snow melts at last, the ground thaws, and one day it begins to rain. And the rain continues all night. And on that one big night, all of the wood frogs and all of the spotted salamanders and all of the Jefferson salamanders and all the spring peepers clamber up from the underground burrows where they've spent the winter on that one big night and migrate across the landscape to vernal pools to breed on one big night. And we call this myth Big Night. And a lot of that is true. And the reason I call it a myth is because it almost never happens on just one night. In any given season, we might have 2 or 3 or 4 big nights, a few medium nights, a handful of small nights. Tonight might be one of those nights in Keene, in fact. Sometimes the migration is a flood, and sometimes it's a trickle. And it really, the reason for all of that is because of the conditions that lead to a migration. It's all weather dependent, and there's as many changes to the weather in New England in the spring as you can imagine. And before we move on to that, I just want to point out this photo that was taken by my friend Dave in upstate New York. And what I love about this photo is that this spotted salamander has just emerged from its underground burrow. You can see the mud still caked to its face and its body from emerging from the soil. It's that exact moment that it has come above ground, which is really incredible. And as we talk about these critters, you'll see even how incredible it is that he captured that moment, because these animals spend 95% of their lives underground. So this moment of emergence is really something. So the question that people ask me by far the most often every spring is, when will the salamanders migrate? And I wish that I could say April 15th, put it on your calendar, don't miss it, and that we could plan around it like that. But it's not like that. It's all weather dependent. And really what we're, and predicting it is a tricky affair. And it varies quite a bit too, from one place to another, because it's so weather dependent. So the 3 things, I'll tell you what we're looking for when we're trying to predict an amphibian migration, and what you will become attuned to if you start to join the crossing brigades and go out in search of amphibians on these nights. The first thing, this is what we're waiting for right now, is thawed ground, minimal snow cover. That's because the animals that migrate in the earliest parts of the spring, the frogs and salamanders, they spend their winter underground. And so even if above ground conditions are perfect for them, if there are inches of frozen soil above their heads, they won't get the message until that soil has thawed. So this is the big factor right now here in the Monadnock region, is what's thawed and what's not thawed, and how long has it thawed for. Wood frogs need at least a day or so of thawed conditions in order to spring to life in the spring. The second thing is warm nighttime temperatures. So these animals are ectotherms, which means that the temperatures of their bodies mirrors the temperatures of their surroundings. And so if it's much below 40 degrees, and they just won't move they won't be moving much. So we're really looking for mid 40s is perfect for them, but they'll start to go even around, say, 40 degrees. But that's what we're looking for. And it has to be these temperatures at night, because that's when these migrations happen, after dark. The last thing is rain. And I always put a little asterisk here, because there are so many forms of spring rain and wet weather. So we could, in an ideal classic big night, we'll have a 45-degree steady rain. But some years I've seen amphibians migrate in a light mist or a heavy fog, or maybe it started raining earlier in the night and it stopped, but the ground is still wet. There's a lot of variations here. And we spend a lot of time looking at the weather forecast, and I can tell you that there are many, many days and nights in New England in the spring when the forecast is 40% chance of showers. And that makes it really tough to know very far in advance when a migration will happen. But we do our best to predict and to let you know. So this is what we're looking for. And this is why Big Night is so variable. It can happen in the Monadnock region really anytime from mid-March through early May. Folks who are further south have already had their first migrations of the year down in Connecticut and Massachusetts. Their migration started in February. Folks up north in Ontario or the North Country, you know, your migration season might extend into mid-May or later. And this is part of the reason that it's a regional project where we coordinate volunteers regionally, because we can't keep track of the weather everywhere in New England. It's tough enough to keep track of the weather here in the Monadnock region. So that's what spurs the migration. And then of course, like the burning question, the other burning question besides when will they migrate is, why are they migrating? Why are these salamanders crossing roads in the first place? And this is a breeding migration for the most part. These early spring migrations are breeding migrations. So these animals are moving from the woods where they spend 11 months of the year, some cases underground, other cases like with frogs, they may be above ground during the summer months and below ground in the winter. But they're moving from the woods to vernal pools and other wetlands to court and to lay their eggs. And then they're moving back into the woods. So these are breeding migrations. And it's not that they're attracted to roads in particular, it's just that in our landscape now, between the woods where they live most of their lives and the wetlands where they breed, roads have often appeared on the landscape. And so they just have to cross them to get where they're going. And I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is that these species have what's called strong site fidelity, attachment to their breeding sites. They return to the same places year after year after year. And so there are patterns that emerge on the landscape where these migrations happen. And it also means that they don't have a great deal of choice in the matter sometimes about whether or not to cross a road. If they want to lay eggs for that year and reproduce, they may just have to cross a road to get to their wetland and then cross back on their way back to the woods. So they're not specifically seeking out roads, there's just that roads are in their way. Good. Okay, so now we're going to kind of take a whirlwind tour through the amphibians that you might see out and about on migration nights, and dividing them kind of into early spring and then mid and late spring. And that's because as the weather warms, more and more species are out and about, and some of them are migrating to wetlands to breed, and others are just enjoying the weather, foraging, dispersing, looking for new places to be. But early in the season, there's really at most of our sites just the big three species that you are likely to see. And we're going to talk about how to identify one from another. And we're going to start with our poster child, our poster salamander, the spotted salamander, this guy right here. They're pretty distinctive. And once you've seen one, it's hard to mistake it for anything else. These are large salamanders, 7 to 9 inches long, about as thick around as your thumb. And they have bright yellow polka dots. So that is pretty distinctive. It's hard to mistake them for anything else. They can live, one thing I always like to share about them is that they can live upwards of 20 years. So for some of the younger folks here, if you happen to see a spotted salamander, you could be looking at an animal that's older than you are, which I always think is remarkable. And the other thing about them is that they have incredibly charming smiles, and everybody falls immediately in love with them the first time they lay eyes on a spotted salamander because of these smiles. So bright yellow polka dots, spotted salamander. Our next one is a frog species, the wood frog. This picture makes it look very large, but they rarely get bigger than about 3 inches. So think smaller than the palm of your hand. They are tan or brown in color, or sometimes orangey. And the distinctive thing to look for with them is this dark brown bandit's mask behind each eye. That is distinctive to a wood frog. Even when they're juveniles, they have that. And that's the key identifying feature when you're seeing one. And then they also, once they make it to their vernal pool or other wetland to breed, the males make a pretty distinctive sound as well. And you might not hear this on the very first migration nights because they're still making their way to the pond. But once they get there, you might be serenaded if you can hear the pool from the road by this sound. You guys hear that okay? Every few years, somebody asks me about these ducks they heard quacking in the middle of the woods in April, and it's not ducks, it's never ducks, it's wood frogs, male wood frogs in particular. So wood frogs, their superpower is that they survive winter by freezing solid. Their heart stops beating, their lungs stop breathing, their kidneys stop functioning, and they basically produce a natural antifreeze to keep their organs from sustaining significant damage. And as a result, they're quite cold tolerant, and they don't have to overwinter very deep below the forest floor. So they might only be 3 inches or so below the forest floor. And that matters when we're thinking about the migration, because that's only that many inches of the forest soil really need to thaw in order for wood frogs to get the message that spring is here. Salamanders cannot survive freezing, and so they need to overwinter deeper below the forest floor, below the freeze line. And so for them, sometimes it takes them a little longer to come out and about. So sometimes our very first migration nights of the year are just frogs. And this is just a picture of wood frogs breeding in a vernal pool. I didn't talk too much about vernal pools, but some of these species are very dependent on a specific kind of wetland known as a vernal pool, which is a depression in the forest floor. It fills with melting snow and spring rain and typically dries up by late summer, which means there's no fish there. And that's important because fish will eat amphibian eggs and amphibian young. And so wood frogs and spotted salamanders have adapted to breeding in these specialized wetlands. Sometimes they're called wicked big puddles. And this is a picture that I love because you can see the wood frogs, some of them in what's called amplexus, where they're gripped together, and you can see tons of wood frog eggs, and this female here laying her eggs right at this very moment that this photo was taken, which I always think is really amazing. So spotted salamander, wood frogs with a bandit's mask. And then our third of the big 3 that you're likely to hear, you guys are gonna say what this is in the chat once I play the sound for you. So what do we have here? The spring peeper, the sound of spring, right? Peepers are one of our smallest frogs. Their Latin name, Pseudocris crucifer, comes from this cross that can sometimes be seen on their back, crucifer, crucify. They are tree frogs, so they've got suction cup toes, these little toe pads here. And they're pretty tiny. Even as full-grown adults, they don't get much bigger than the tip of your thumb. So here's some pictures for scale. In color, they can be tan or brown or even a little bit orange. But size and the fact that they have suction cup toes are the big identifying features for spring peepers. And that sound that they make, the peepers that are peeping, those are the males that are establishing territories in their wetlands and defending them vigorously against other males and also hoping to attract females. And they can peep 3,000 to 4,000 times in an hour, which is really remarkable. And it's been, as I'm sure you've all heard, just an incredibly loud chorusing when a bunch of them get together. It's been recorded at up to 120 decibels. So that's on par with, say, a loud concert or a chainsaw at close range, maybe even louder than a jackhammer. So for an animal that is only barely bigger than a quarter, they make an impressive mark on the world. So at most of our sites, these are the 3 amphibians you're likely to see in early spring on migration nights. And then at some of our sites, such as in Keene, at Jordan Road and at River Road in Westmoreland, and a few other places, there's a 4th early spring amphibian, and that is the Jefferson Salamander. These are related to spotted salamanders. They're both part of a family of salamanders called the mole salamanders, which are so named because they spend most of their time underground like moles do. These do not have the bright yellow spots that spotted salamanders have. Instead, they've got kind of pale blue flecking. They are a little smaller than spotted salamanders, so maybe 5 to 7 inches long. They've got these long toes. And they also have a very flat tail that's kind of like a rudder, whereas spotted salamanders have a more rounded tail. And Jefferson salamanders are actually a little bit more cold tolerant and will come out a little earlier in the season. There's also a related salamander known as the blue spotted salamander. And in places where they coexist, they frequently hybridize. And you cannot tell from looking whether a salamander is a Jefferson salamander, a blue spotted salamander, or a hybrid. You actually have to run genetic tests if you really want to parse that out. And so we assume that the Jefferson salamanders, we say Jefferson salamander for short, but we're assuming that most of what we encounter are these hybrids. And these are a species of greatest conservation need in the state of New Hampshire and a number of neighboring states as well. They are much less common. They are much more dependent on vernal pool habitat than some of these other amphibians that can take advantage of different kinds of wetlands. And they are really quite remarkable for their genetics. I've read that they challenge the very notion of what it means to be a species, these hybrids. And one example of that is that there are all female lineages of these Jefferson complex salamanders that essentially use genetic material from male salamanders that are either true Jeffersons or true blue spots to initiate egg development, but then they don't pass any of that genetic material along to their offspring. So they're essentially, it's a term that's been called kleptogenesis, klepto meaning stealing, genesis, genetic material. So they're kind of stealing spermatophores from a male salamander in order to clone themselves, which is really something else. I didn't really talk about this earlier, but for spotted salamanders and Jefferson salamanders, when they get to the vernal pool, often the males will migrate first. So the first migration nights might be almost all males. This is also true of wood frogs. And the males, once they get to their vernal pool, will deposit little packets of sperm on the bottom of the pool. Those are called spermatophores. And when the females arrive, they will select the spermatophores that they want. We don't know how they choose. And they will absorb those through their cloaca and then have internal fertilization of their eggs. So it's internal fertilization, but the salamanders may or may not have come into any contact with one another as part of that process, which is something else. And often there's mixed paternity of salamander egg masses. So those are the big 3+1, I would say, that happen in the early spring. They're highly vernal pool dependent. Those are true breeding migrations. And then as things get warmer, more and more amphibians are out and about on warm, wet nights. And so we'll talk a little bit about those too, because as we get into April and even into early May, we see other critters on the road. So the first one I'm going to start with is the top left here. This is the salamander that I'm guessing most of you are pretty familiar with. You can, if you want, you can write in the chat what species this one is here. When I tell people that I work with salamanders, this is the very first species that they think of. And that is, I think, because they are also one of our only diurnal or day active and terrestrial, meaning above ground salamander species in New Hampshire. So you probably have seen red Fs wandering around in the woods on rainy summer days. Most of our other salamander species are either active at night or underground or in streams, and so they're not as visible to us. But red Fs are really visible. They're bright orange, so again, pretty hard to mistake them for anything else. They're small salamanders, so smaller than your pinky finger. They have those orange spots down their back. And what's interesting about them, we don't see them a ton on migration nights because they're day active, but we do occasionally see them. What's interesting about them is that they are the juvenile form of this very different looking salamander, the eastern newt, which is the salamander that you see swimming around in lakes, ponds, beaver wetlands. And for many years, biologists assumed that these were two different species because their life histories are very different and they look very different. But it turns out it's the same species and they just have a really complex life history. So they start off as eggs in water and as hatch into larvae that have gills for breathing in the water. Then they metamorphose, they grow lungs and legs and they turn into red Fs and they take to the woods. And they can live typically in the woods for 2 to 3 years, wandering widely. They can travel miles. And sometimes they can stay in the woods in that life form for up to 7 years. So 2 to 7 years, they're red Fs. and then they transition again. Their skin gets thinner so that they can absorb oxygen through it. It turns olive green. Their tail changes shape to become more rudder-like for swimming. And they turn into these adult newts that live in completely aquatic lives. And they can be in the adult form for another 7 to 10 years, which is really quite remarkable. So we almost never see adult newts out on big nights because they are aquatic species, but we do occasionally see red Fs. And I think on your data forms that we'll talk about later, they say, it might say Eastern newt, not red F. Down, moving on to down here below, we've got our kind of most common woodland salamander, most common vertebrate in all of our forests. This is the red back salamander, the distinctive, it's also a small salamander about the size of your pinky finger, very small legs. And the distinctive feature there is that rust red stripe running down their back, as well as their small legs. And they don't have breeding migrations. They actually lay their eggs on in rotting logs, but they do go out and forage on wet nights and can even climb shrubs in pursuit of insects. So we do see them out there, especially as temperatures start to warm. So that's our redback salamander. You might be familiar with them from your wood pile if you live in a place where you have wood, or from just turning over logs in the woods. The one next to that is less common, but does occur here in the Monadnock region. The Forest Lake Road in Winchester has lots of these, and I sometimes see them in Harrisville. These are our four-toed salamander. They're named that because they have 4 toes on each foot, whereas many other salamanders have 4 toes on the front feet and 5 toes on the rear feet. However, I do not recommend that you try to count their toes in order to identify them because they are very tiny and it would be very difficult to do that. They're quite squirmy as well. So if you want to, if you see a salamander and you think it might be a 4-toed, the thing that I look for is this constriction at the base of their tail. Kind of looks like an hourglass. That's pretty distinctive. And they also have black and white speckled bellies. They do not like it when you look at their bellies, but if you get a quick look, you can confirm that it's a 4-toed. And these are more likely to be found. They are swamp salamanders. They lay their eggs in sphagnum moss. So more likely to be found at crossing sites where there are kind of permanent wetlands or mossy wetlands nearby. And one last salamander species, I used to leave this one out, but it's showing up places. This is also, all of these are pretty small salamander species. They're all about pinky size. Very different from the mole salamanders, which are large. This one, the distinctive feature here, and the reason it gets its name, are these 2 long black lines running parallel down its back. This is the northern 2-line salamander, kind of yellowish in color, and with those 2 dark lines. And these are stream salamanders. I don't know why they're out and about on these rainy nights. It's not a breeding migration, but maybe they're just taking advantage of the opportunity to find a new place to be. But I do see them out and about later in the spring. So, and I will also mention that we have Amphibian Id Sheets that are part of our volunteer handbook and also available as standalone downloads on our website. And so you don't have to remember all of this right now. You can go to our website and download these ID sheets and take, put them in a plastic sheet protector and take them out with you on big night if you want, or just, take a closer look. And all of the key identifying characteristics are outlined on those ID sheets. So you don't have to remember, although I will be doing some quizzes later tonight. So, okay, so then moving on to our frogs that come out as it gets warmer. This one up here we'll start with, this is our gray tree frog. So these tree frogs, they look like bark, they live on bark, they hunt insects that live in bark. They are, fully adapted for life in trees, except when they come down out of the trees and migrate to wetlands to breed in mid-late April and early May. And their identifying characteristics, there's a few. They have really bumpy skin that looks like bark, often gray in color, although it can change. It can change individuals can change based on what their background is so that they can be really well camouflaged. And as youngsters, they can be very bright green in color as well. But always have bumpy skin. And then they also are tree frogs. So they've got those suction cup toes. These toe pads are pretty distinctive, and they can range in size. The juveniles that can be bright green might be, the size of the tip of your thumb, but then the adult gray tree frogs can grow up to 3 inches or so in length. So almost the size of the palm of your hand. So there's a lot of variation with them. They are adorable. So the next one next to them is the pickerel frog. This is often mistaken for a leopard frog. And I can tell you that in the Monadnock region of Southwest New Hampshire, it is very uncommon to see leopard frogs. We do not have them here in any great numbers. And leopard frogs have very round spots. Pickerel frogs have very boxy spots, rectangular in shape. So that is a key identifying feature. Besides their really rectangular spots is this yellow color that you can see that is often in their inner thigh area. That's distinctive for them. The two on the bottom are dwellers of lakes and ponds, and sometimes other types of more permanent wetlands. So they're certainly not migrating for breeding purposes, but they may be out and about looking for food. They look very similar, and there's a few ways to tell them apart. We've got green frogs and bullfrogs. So first and foremost, if you find a frog and it weighs 5 pounds and you are in New Hampshire and it is in the wild, it is a bullfrog, because nothing else gets that big. Bullfrogs are enormous. They grow to be enormous. They are voracious eaters. They can pretty much eat anything that they can fit in their jaws. And so they get really big. But as youngsters, they can be easily confused with green frogs, because both of them are often green in color, although that varies quite a bit. Sometimes there's some mottling or dark spotting. My go-to for telling a bullfrog from a green frog is to look at their back. And you can see this green frog has what are called dorsolateral ridges. So 2 parallel ridges running along their back. The bullfrog does not have that. And so that's what I always look for. If you are unsure what you're looking at and you want to send us a picture to help with ID, if you can send us a picture that shows their back, that will really help. And these ones will not only be out and about on warm spring nights, but also warm summer nights. Any road near water on a warm summer night will probably have green frogs and bullfrogs hopping around. And then maybe saving the best for last. This one's a class all its own. My favorite, the American toad. I'm sure most of you have seen these in your gardens before. They're pretty distinctive. They also have really bumpy, warty skin, brown or tan or orange in color, and they look grumpy all the time. And that's what I love maybe the most about the American toad, is their grumpiness. And they can be very tiny. I've seen toadlets that could fit on the top of a dime. And they can also grow quite large to be, bigger than you could fit in the palm of your hand, depending on how old they are. So there's a wide range, but they've got really that bumpy, warty skin, and also really stout posture. And they're one of the few frogs that that walk often instead of just hopping. You often will see them walking or crawling. So this is our American toad, and they do have breeding migrations. They will be on roads near water in very high numbers in late April. And one of my favorite field guide to amphibians, I always like to show this. The males, like with most frogs, the males sing or chorus. And my favorite field guide called it a stunningly beautiful call for such a warty creature, which I always thought was great. So a few look-alike. Sometimes we get questions about two species that look sort of similar. And so I'm gonna highlight a few of those so that you can think about this as you try to tell them apart. So both gray tree frogs and American toads have really bumpy skin. And sometimes it can be easy to mistake them for one another. And so the things that I look for are the color of their skin. So gray tree frogs will be grayish or greenish in color, whereas toads will be more brown, tan, or orange. Their postures are different. Gray tree frogs tend to sit lower to the ground, and toads are often more upright and kind of, they almost look like bodybuilders to me. They're really stout, or like bulldogs. And then their toes are really different because gray tree frogs need to be able to climb vertically. So they've got these suction cup toes, and toads are basically hoppers. So they have pointy toes. So those are the three things that I look for to tell a gray tree frog from a toad: posture, color, and their type of their toe. Sometimes also people wonder between gray tree frogs and spring peepers. Here in New Hampshire, these are the only two tree frog species we have. And so they both have suction cup toes, or toe pads, for climbing. But their skin is really different. So and sometimes their size can be different too. So gray tree frogs can be small, but they can also grow to be the size of the palm of your hand. The spring peeper will never get that big. So that's one key factor. But another is to look at their skin. Spring peepers have tan or orange skin that's very smooth. And gray tree frogs have gray or greenish skin that's quite bumpy. So that's a way to tell the difference between these two. And the last two lookalikes occasionally, if you're looking really quickly, wood frogs and spring peepers are usually distinguishable by size, because spring peepers are always small and wood frogs are mostly not small. They're mostly much bigger. And so sometimes for folks who are really new to this and they're out at our North Lincoln Street crossing site and they, is it a big frog or a small frog? Because those are the only two species we really have early in the season at that site. But later in the season, we do occasionally get juvenile wood frogs, immature wood frogs that aren't breeding, but they just, they're out and about. And they can be the same size as peepers. And so if you're ever unsure, you can always look at right behind the eye. That dark bandit's mask is key for wood frogs. Spring peepers don't have it. And there's also, we talked about those dorsolateral ridges with bullfrogs and green frogs. That's also true of wood frogs have them and peepers don't. So and one last thing, what if you can't tell? After all of this, what if you're not sure? So you have a few options if you're out and about on a migration night at a road crossing with us. Some of our sites have volunteers known as site coordinators. We'll talk about them in a bit, but they're like the go-to people on these big nights, and they've really studied up. So they, if you have a site coordinator at your site, they'll be wearing a vest that says Harris Center in reflective lettering. You can ask them for help, and they've got laminated versions of our Amphibian Id Sheets with them, and just they know amphibians pretty well. So you can always ask. So not all of our sites will have site coordinators, and if you're out on your own site, what can you do? You can always take a picture and send it in. We love to see and share pictures. Where is this not going? There we go. We have an online form for photo submission on the website. You can also email me. We love to see pictures of amphibians. And as an example, this is a picture from our Forest Lake Road crossing in Winchester from probably 15 years ago now. And Deb Godey was out there that night, and she sent this in and said, "Brett, what is this?" So if those of you are, want to put some guesses in the chat, like, what is this salamander? It's got yellow markings, but are they spots? And there's another kind of salamander we didn't talk about tonight that's endangered in the state of New Hampshire. I've never seen one in the wild, but they do occur historically one town over from where this salamander was found, and they're called marbled salamander. And so there was a lot of discussion, is this a hybrid between a spotted salamander and a marbled salamander? I sent this picture around to a lot of my herpetologist friends and listservs and lots of hemming and hawing. And in the end, we decided it was just a really weird looking spotted salamander. But it was great discussion and we enjoyed having it. So if you're not sure, take a picture and send it in. Okay. So before we move on, are there pressing questions related to species ID?
There's a question you might get to later, but there was a question about if touching salamanders and frogs is not safe for the animal.
I will definitely get to that later. I will say in the short run, in general, it's not great to handle wildlife. It stresses them out a lot. I do think that migration nights on roads is an exception when we handle them briefly, because our hands are a lot less dangerous than a car tire. And I'll talk about how to handle them safely a little bit later. Cool. Okay, so now we're going to move into the so what part of the night. Why should we care about amphibians? Why do they matter? Aside from their intrinsic value as living beings and because we appreciate them. But they're also really important ecologically. And so one way that biologists use to assess and compare the roles of different species in any given ecosystem or any given time and place is this concept called biomass. And in its simplest form, biomass is a calculation that you can make where you can add the mass of one individual of a species to the mass of all the other individuals of that species. You get a number. And then you can do that with a different species and compare the two. So for instance, if I wanted to calculate the biomass of human beings in the Harris Center building, I would add my mass to Susie's mass to Karen's mass, to all of our colleagues, and I'd get a number. And then maybe I wanted to compare that mass to the biomass of all the ants or mice in that building. And the numbers might surprise you because mice and ants are small, but they tend to be much more numerous than we are. And so scientists have done this in our northeastern forests, looking at the biomass of amphibians and how it compares to other species. And there's a really well-known study from the 1970s in the Hubbard Brook experimental forest where they looked just at this one species, the redback salamander, and found that their biomass was greater than that of all the breeding birds combined during peak bird breeding season. And new studies that are being conducted more recently are finding that that was probably an underestimate of redback salamander biomass because they can be tricky to find and measure because they live underground. Another study in Massachusetts was looking just at vernal pool breeding species, so wood frogs, spotted salamanders, Jefferson salamanders, and found that their biomass was greater than that of all the birds and small mammals in the 50 acres or so surrounding that vernal pool. So what does that mean? It means that there is an incredible amount of energy moving through our forests and wetlands in the bodies of these amphibians. And that plays out most significantly in the food web. So they are incredibly important food for nearly every species that you can think of: herons and turkeys and snakes and turtles and foxes and coyotes, you name it, it probably eats an amphibian. And not just as adult animals either. So I love this quote from some vernal pool biologists out of Maine about vernal pools likely serving as fast food oases for spring wildlife in New England for at least 10,000 years. So if you think about what our woods look like right now, they are pretty brown. There aren't too many seeds or nuts left over from last year's crop. There aren't really buds yet. There aren't fruits. There aren't flying insects. It's a lean time. There's not a lot of food in the woods for animals like turtles or foxes who have overwintered. And if they happen to find their way to a wicked big puddle in the woods and there's these nuggets of protein just sitting there, a Blanding's turtle is going to wade in and eat some of those eggs and be grateful for it. And okay, here's a little quiz for yourselves. What species is this? What species of frog? Yeah, wood frog. So it's a tiny wood frog. It's sitting on the tip of someone's thumb because it's a brand new wood frog, but it still has that dark bandit's mask. That's how you can tell. So it's not uncommon for a small vernal pool to produce 10,000 froglets in a given year. And if they're lucky, 10 of them will make it to adulthood. The rest are food. And then on the flip side, they're also really important predators of invertebrates, insects, worms, beetles. This is a series my friend Dave took of what species is the amphibian in here. I almost revealed it. Someone can chime in on the chat. Yes, Brooks got it. American toad, nice and warty tan skin. So this is a toad eating a wasp, and toads can eat 3 times their weight in insects each day during the growing season. 50 to 100 insects a night, up to 10,000 individual insects in a growing season, one toad. So think about how that plays out with all the toads and all the wood frogs and all the salamanders. they are right there in the middle of the food web. And there's even been studies that have shown that vernal pools that have spotted salamander larvae in them have fewer mosquito larvae, not only because the salamander larvae eat the mosquitoes, but because the mosquitoes will preferentially lay their eggs in other places when spotted salamander larvae are present, because they want their young to survive too. And they're better off in a place with not as many predators. Vernal pools are still very mosquito-y places in late spring, but would be more so without our spotted salamanders. They're also, from a bigger picture perspective, they're very sensitive. So part of the concern about handling amphibians is that they have porous skin. They can very easily absorb toxins through that skin. And so they're very sensitive to environmental pollutants and also to disease. This is an outdated map, but there isn't a current one yet. It's in the process of being investigated. So this map goes all the way back to 2008. It's from the IUCN, which is the International Union of Conservation Scientists. I can't remember the exact acronym, but they're tasked with looking at threatened and endangered species worldwide. And so they're right now in the process of updating this map. They have been for the last few years. But this map shows all of those colors represent the number of species that are threatened or presumed, salamander species that are threatened or presumed extinct in these places. So there are places in the world that have more threatened or extinct salamander species than we have in the entirety of New Hampshire. 41% of amphibians worldwide are threatened, largely due to habitat loss, as well as disease and pollution. And we are very fortunate to live in a space that has no colors on this map. We have some locally rare species that some of you have mentioned, like Fowler's toads or spadefoot toads. But we are very fortunate that we still have many amphibians, that they are still common, and we can help keep them that way. And one of their big threats, habitat loss is certainly a threat, pollution is certainly a threat. But one of the big threats, and the one that we're focused on tonight, is roadkill or amphibian road mortality. So if you're inclined, if you'd like to put in the chat, when I say the word roadkill, what species do you think of? What species, when you think of roadkill, do you think of? Raccoons, deer, squirrels, skunks. So we often think of large-bodied animals who are hit one at a time and whose carcasses stay on the road for a while where we can see them. It feels like a one at a time kind of thing. So amphibians, it's a different story altogether, because amphibians, when they're hit by cars, it's at night, where it's dark, it's rainy. Their bodies are very soft, and so they're easily kind of crushed beyond recognition or scavenged by crows or other scavengers by the time morning rolls around. So unless you're out there on these nights, you don't really see what's happening in terms of roadkill for amphibians. And in addition, this spring breeding migration, with its explosiveness, this incredible phenomenon of thousands of amphibians being on the move at once, means that you could have dozens or hundreds of amphibians all on a road at the same time, which makes them incredibly vulnerable to even just a few cars, in a way that species that travel kind of individually don't experience. And so there's been a lot of studies that are showing that roadkill is a huge concern for reptiles and amphibians in particular. The one that really blew my mind when I started doing this is an older study now, but in Canada, they looked at a 2-mile stretch of road over 4 years and documented 30,000 dead amphibians. Another study in New York State looked at salamanders trying to cross a paved rural road and found best case scenario was that only 1 of every 2 made it across. And then in Massachusetts, there was a study in the Berkshires that found that they could lose their spotted salamanders just due to road mortality in as few as 25 years. So this is a really big deal for amphibians, even if we don't see it. Location matters. This doesn't happen everywhere. There are patterns and places where this happens. And the reason it happens is because these roads are adjacent to habitat that is used by these animals. So roads near water are the big important places to keep an eye out for both amphibians and reptiles like turtles and snakes, particularly causeways where there's water on both sides of the road. This is a picture from my town of Harrisville. This is a spot that's huge for toads and also for turtles later on in the spring. And then traffic volume matters too. So if you think about it, a 4-lane highway probably doesn't have an amphibian crossing over it anymore. It maybe had it one time, but it's probably gone now. And a dirt road with 1 or 2 houses on it is also probably not a huge deal. There's not enough traffic to make a difference, but it's these middle of the road sites, so to speak, where the biggest impact is happening. These are our paved rural roads, like the ones that many of us drive every day, that are having, where road mortality is having an impact on amphibians. But thankfully, so that was the sad part. Now is the more hopeful part, which is that this is a problem with solutions. So one really great solution is amphibian tunnels to help them move under the road instead of over the road, and fencing to guide them to the tunnels. These are used effectively in many places. They are the most effective solution because they're available to amphibians at any time, whether people are there or not. So here's some pictures. These are the world famous Henry Street amphibian tunnels in Amherst, Mass, the very first ones in all of North America. You can see spotted salamanders coming through and some wood frogs. This doesn't look like much, but is an exciting picture because this is the new Moncton Road, one of the new Moncton Road salamander tunnels in Moncton, Vermont. I think these opened in 2018. And this is a trail cam photo of the very first spotted salamander to cross through the tunnel. And they have thousands, they've documented with their trail cam photos, thousands of amphibians using these tunnels every year now, and many other animals as well, from bobcats to raccoons. These are the most effective way to go. They're also very expensive. So this Moncton project costs about $400,000 for 2 tunnels, and that's not available for every community, and it's not necessarily appropriate for every community and every site. The Moncton site, it made a lot of sense because they had thousands of salamanders, they had rare species, and it was a good place to put in a solution like this. In other places, other communities are turning to something that's much less expensive. It's less effective because it really relies on people, and people being able to predict the migration with enough lead time to put this into place. But these amphibian road closures, so closing roads where these migrations happen on the nights when the highest percentage of amphibians are likely to be on the roads. So this is less effective because there's going to be all those small nights that might not be captured in road closures like this. And of course, there's also the time in the summer when the young are leaving the wetlands. Those migrations are much less concentrated, more difficult to predict. And so you can't easily organize road closures around them. But even if you have a half a dozen road closures a year on the nights with the biggest likelihood of amphibian activity, that can make a real difference. And I'm really excited to report, I'll tell you later, but we're doing this in Keene, New Hampshire, and as a result of this Salamander Crossing Brigade project, and it's really exciting. But before you can put road closures into place or tunnels or any of it, you need to collect information about these sites. It doesn't maybe make a lot of sense to close a road if there are 10 salamanders on that road in a given night, but it might make sense to close a road if there's 1,000 of them. And so all of these projects, tunnels, road closures, they all started with people going out on migration nights and collecting data about where these amphibian crossing hotspots were and what species were involved and how many of them were involved. And that's where we come in. That's what this project, the Salamander Crossing Brigade project, is designed to do. So before I move on to talking about the Salamander Crossing Brigades, is there any pressing questions?
Yeah, Brett, there is a great couple of questions about the tunnels. Do predators learn to use those tunnels?
There's been some evidence that predators use them, but there's not a lot of hunting happening in them. If you think about it, there's really only a lot of amphibians in them a few nights a year. So it's doesn't seem to be an issue yet.
And have there been studies that show if the amphibians that have tunnels, does that just become their new, like they learn to use the tunnels?
Well, the tunnels work best and really only work if there's also fencing or curbing to guide the amphibians to them. So the amphibians try to cross the road and they hit a fence and they can't get through it. And so they walk along the fence until when they can get through, and that's the tunnel. So amphibians don't learn to use them until you direct them to the tunnels. And that's part of the expense of the project, is building or maintaining fencing or curbing to guide them to where they need to be.
That's it. Thanks, Brett.
So now we're going to talk about the Salamander Crossing Brigades, what they are, how they work, how you can join in. So the Salamander Crossing Brigades, what are they? What do they do? And this is divided into kind of 2 time periods. There's before the big nights and on the big nights. So before the big nights, the first thing is you attend a training. So you are halfway there. You've already gotten this part down. That's great. The next thing is that you're staying on call. So you'll remember, like, we can't predict the migration. We can't pencil it into our calendars. So our crossing brigades, once the season starts, are really watching the weather and kind of staying alert for when a migration might happen. And how do you find out when a big night will happen? There's a few ways. One is sign up for our email list. You can go to harriscenter.org and to our Salamander Brigade page, and there's a link there for our email list, and you can sign up tonight if you want. And sign up for our email list, and we will email folks when we think a migration is likely, when after a migration has happened, to report on the amphibian activity that happened, share salamander news. We try not to send too many emails. So if you are wondering and you haven't heard from us, we keep a 5-day salamander forecast on our website that we update almost daily. And so if you are thinking there might be a migration, but you haven't gotten an email about it, you can always go check the salamander forecast. It's active in season. It is geared towards the Monadnock region. So if you live further afield, you can also just do what we do and watch the weather. In addition to staying on call, while you're doing that, you're also going to get your gear together. You're going to get ready for big night. So when you go out, bring or wear, first and foremost, a reflective vest. This is an essential piece of safety equipment. If you do not have a reflective vest or can't find the one you do have, do not go out on a road for big night. It is that important and essential for being seen by cars. They're pretty inexpensive. You can buy them at most sporting goods stores, hardware stores, the internet. If you live in the Monadnock region and cost is a barrier for you, the Harris Center does have a set of loaners, so you can reach out to Karen Sievert or I, and we can loan one to you. But this is crucial. Face masks seem to be becoming less important, but who knows what will change over time. And so if you think you might be in a position where you're gathering closely with other people in the field, such as to admire salamanders, it's always good to pack a face mask with you just in case. Rain gear. It will be raining. That is the whole point of big night. And so you will be much more comfortable if you have not only a rain jacket, but also rain pants and possibly rain boots. Also, we often say that these are the first warm, rainy nights of spring, but warm to a wood frog who can literally freeze solid and survive is not the same thing as warm to a human being. And a few hours out in 42-degree rain can get pretty chilly. So definitely recommend you bundle up. Bright lights are essential. Cell phone flashlights are not good enough. You need at least a flashlight or a headlamp. Many of us use both. I like headlamps because they help me see my data forms and they help cars see me. But for scanning the pavement for amphibians, nothing beats a handheld flashlight where you can direct the beam. And you want to make sure that those are fully charged or have fresh batteries in them before you head out. Data forms and pencils. So you can download data forms on our website. If you're at a site that has a site coordinator, they may have data forms to hand out to you. Those are printed on what's called Write in the Rain paper, which has a really waxy substance on it to help that paper not fall apart when it gets wet, but you can't write on it with pen, only with pencil. And in general, pencil is easier for writing in the rain, even on regular paper. Clipboard, notepad, something to lean on while you do your data collection. It's really great to pair up. So have one person maybe recording the data count, the amphibian counts, and the other person actually moving the amphibians across the road, which we'll talk about in a minute. You definitely want to take pictures because these are amazing animals and you are going to want to share this moment with your friends and family. And we also have a form on our website for submitting your photos to us. And if you share them with us, we will share them with the whole Salamander Crossing community through our emails, social media, and the field reports on our website. So the last two items are optional. I don't bring these myself, but some people like them. The bucket. At some sites on some nights, we have so many frogs on the road or other amphibians that it can feel more efficient to put a number of them in a bucket and carry them across the road all at once than to move them across one at a time. So you can choose to bring a bucket for this purpose. If you do, it is essential that that is not the bucket you just grabbed out of your hall closet that was last used to bleach the kitchen floor. It should not have any cleansers or toxins or anything on it that could be absorbed by, through the skin of these amphibians. The other option is related to finding casualties on the road. So if you do this long enough, you're going to see an amphibian that has been hit by a car and has died. So you have options in that moment. You can stick your hands in your ears and go, la, 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 I don't see that, and just pretend it doesn't exist and focus completely on the living. That is your choice. But if you decide that you're going to record the dead animal on your data sheet, we ask that you remove it from the road. And that is so that if we had 5 people walking past the same dead wood frog and they each recorded it, we might think we had 5 dead wood frogs when we really only had the one. So if you record the dead, we ask that you remove them from the road so they aren't counted multiple times. And you can simply pick them up with your hands like you would a live animal, but some people prefer not to touch them and they like to bring a scoop or a spatula or something to deal with that casualty. I will say that I also often get questions about what to do with injured amphibians. And it's a tough question. It's a hard one to answer. I will tell you that amphibians are incredibly resilient and have amazing abilities to regenerate lost limbs. So if it's an injury to a tail or a leg, they can recover from that. And so what I do in that case is I usually move them off the road and wish them well and count them among the living. If it's an injury to the core body or head, that's a tougher situation and they will likely succumb to that injury at some point. And so I would count those among the dead. So that's what Salamander brigadiers are doing beforehand. On the big nights, you're going to your crossing site. We'll talk about how to find a crossing site in a moment. You're moving amphibians across the road by hand or in your buckets. You're keeping count on your data forms by species. At the end of the night, you're reporting that data either to the site coordinator who is there with you on site or through our online forms. And then really the main reason we have these trainings is to teach you how to stay safe, because this is not an inherently safe activity. It's dark, it's wet. Drivers may not be expecting to see people in the road. And so your first and foremost responsibility is to your safety. So heads and above, here's how to stay safe. Wear a reflective vest. I'm going to tell you this like 5 more times. It's so important. Wear a reflective vest when you are out there. Don't go out without one. This is one of my examples. These are some interns from a number of years ago. Could you see them if they weren't wearing these vests? No, and cars can't see you either. So it's so important for your own safety. Also important to bring a bright light. This makes you visible to passing cars and also makes it easier for you to see salamanders and frogs and to not accidentally step on them. Cell phone flashlights, I say again, are not good enough. And you need a bright light for everyone in your party, not one flashlight for 5 people. You always need to stay alert. Whenever a car comes into view, you need to step off the road for your safety. So we used to call ourselves the Salamander Crossing Guards, but we rebranded because crossing guards stop traffic and we don't do that. It's not safe for us. So you have to be constantly vigilant. And this can be tough because you might be really excited about seeing a spotted salamander for the first time. And you might, be entranced by that salamander and really, start to lose a little sense of where you are. But that's why it's up to all of us who are on the road together to keep each other safe. It's like when you were kids and you were playing and someone yells out car, that's what you do. And everybody gets off the road as soon as a car comes into view. I also recommend that when you're walking down the road, because you're going to be walking down the road, scanning the pavement for amphibians, that you walk in the lane facing traffic so that you can see cars as they're approaching and they're not coming up on you from behind. And then as you go back the other direction, you walk in the opposite lane, but always still facing traffic. You are always going to step aside for cars, even if you're really mad because they didn't slow down and you know they saw the Salamander crossing sign. You still got to step aside for them. You don't attempt to stop traffic. Don't shine your light at cars, even if they've really, made you cranky because they didn't slow down. You usually what I do if a car is passing is I shine the light at myself so they can really see my reflective vest. You need to be visible to them. This last one sounds obvious. If you spend enough time on the road, there's a really good chance that you will be out there and you will see the lights of headlights of a car coming, and you will be stepping aside for your own safety, but you'll also be looking in the road because the headlights of that car are better than any flashlight you will ever have. And so you're looking in those headlights to see what's in the road. And there will come a moment when you see a spotted salamander or a wood frog or a toad in the lights of those oncoming headlights. And there's going to be a voice in your head that says, I bet I could run out there really quick and just grab it really quick before that car gets here. And the next voice that I want you to hear is my voice saying, don't do it. Don't do it. We're all tempted to do it, and it is not safe. The roads are wet. It would be easy for you to slip. It would be easy for a salamander to squirm out of your hands. It is just not safe. You have to let that car pass by unless it comes to a stop on its own. You have to let that car pass by and then go out and hope that the salamander made it through and move it off the road when the car is gone. Do not risk your life. Families, if you want to bring children out, this can be an incredibly powerful and transformative experience for kids, but you need to take some extra precautions. Very young children you should wait to bring them out until they can be safe around traffic. Elementary school age and up, middle elementary school age and up, this is what this is really best for. Young kids, it's just not safe. Some of our crossings are more family friendly than others, and we're going to talk about our crossing sites in a few minutes, but really do some research ahead of time to find one that's more family friendly, slower traffic, better lighting, wider shoulders. Make sure every single person in your group is wearing a reflective vest, kids and adults, to be visible. And I really recommend, if you can, maintaining a 1-to-1 adult to child ratio so that you don't have one person trying to wrangle 4 super excited kids who might be darting into the road because they see a salamander. Enlist your, family members, friends to come out with you and have one adult for each child. And the primary responsibility of that adult is the safety of the child in their care. So there were questions about handling amphibians. In general, as I said, I don't advocate handling wildlife for fun. It stresses them out, and we don't need to stress them out any more than they already are. In this case, we are moving them across the road faster than they can move themselves, and certainly saving at least some of them from being hit by cars. And so I think that the few brief moments that we're handling them justifies the stress that we may be causing them. But you do need to make sure that your hands are clean, wet, and free of toxins. So as we said, there's a lot of people that ask me about, I heard that the natural oils on my skin can harm amphibians. It's not so much the natural oils on your skin as what we put on our skin. Bug spray, perfume, sunblock, hand sanitizer. No hand sanitizer if you are going to be handling amphibians. If you're concerned, you can use nitrile gloves, disposable gloves, instead of bare hands, but hand sanitizer is not good for them and should not be used. You want to keep a gentle, kind of firm hold around the center of their bodies. You don't want to pick them up by their legs or their tails. That can harm them. And also some salamanders actually have the ability to detach their own tails as a distraction and to get away from predators, which we don't want to that really does cause them stress, and then they have to regrow a whole new tail. So we don't want them to have to do that. And I can't believe I have to say this, but I do, because this has happened in the past. Release them gently off the side of the road, please. So you're out there for these nights. You are walking back and forth. You're counting critters. You've got them on your data form. What do you do with that information? If you're at a site with a site coordinator, you can, at the end of the night, check out with them and give them your data form, or just read your counts aloud to them. And they'll include all of the counts from that site at that one night. And then they'll submit them to us. That's really helpful for us to have as just one count per site per night if it's possible. It's just a lot less management on the back end for us. The site coordinators at each site will have vests that say Harris Center on the back. If you don't have a site coordinator at your site or at your own site, or they've went home and you're staying out there, we also have online forms where you can submit your data. And I would really strongly encourage you to send this in either the night of the migration or the very next morning, because I can tell you from experience that the longer you wait, the less likely you will be to submit it. And also, we start to get questions the very next day from folks who are really excited to hear what happened out there. Was there a migration? And we try to, we receive all the data. It takes some time to manage and analyze that data and get it into a form where we can share it back out with all of you. So we try to do that within a week. I will say, although we can accept data from sites outside the Monadnock region, we will not be reporting on that or sharing it out. We're a small operation here, and it's just not manageable for us to be reporting out from sites all over New Hampshire. But the longer you wait, the harder it is for us to share that with other people too. And everybody gets really excited to see what happened on these migration nights. So don't delay. This is Andrew. I always like to show him because he's like exactly kind of what you should look like when you're out on a migration night. And I like to point the features out, although really this is an old picture. Reflective vests have come a long way since then, and a brighter reflective vest would be better. But first and foremost, he's wearing a reflective vest, really important. He has two sources of bright light, a headlamp and a handheld flashlight. He has a pencil clipped to his vest, ready to collect data. He wears glasses, so he knows that he needs a brimmed cap to keep the rain out of his glasses so that he can see clearly and stay alert. And then just as important as the reflective vest, he is smiling, he's happy, and he's enjoying himself. So this is a project where we say, because we can't predict ahead of time, and we're not, with the exception of a few sites in Keene, we're not trying to really tightly manage, how many volunteers are out there. We say, come out if you can and stay as long as you like. And if you're not smiling anymore because you're cold, you're wet, you're tired, it's time to go home. And that's okay. You've heard me mention site coordinators before. I just want to put a plug in because we're always looking for folks to serve as co-coordinators or backup coordinators. These are go-to people at our 10 main crossing sites that we have in the Monadnock region. And they, the hardest thing they do is they stick around for the duration of the migration season. They become familiar with that crossing site. Many of them are at the same sites year after year. We share field equipment with them. So Salamander crossing signs, like the one I have back here, traffic cones, data forms. They orient volunteers. So when you arrive at a site, if you see Salamander crossing signs or traffic cones, there's a good chance there's a site coordinator there. And you can go up to the person in the Harris Center vest and ask them to, if it's your first time at that site, what you need to know, where to look for critters, if they have a data form for you. They can help you identify amphibian species. And then at the end of the night, when you leave, if you give your counts to them, they will submit the count on behalf of that site. So you don't have to worry about doing that. And I should say, if you're interested, you live in the Monadnock region, you can reach out to Karen or I about being a co-coordinator at our sites. So I think that we have gone over what to expect on big nights. In person, I would show you a video right now, but I don't want to spend any more screen time looking at videos, but I am going to encourage you to watch this video that's on our web, a link to it's on our website called Nature Minute, and it really gives a good sense of what it's like out there on big nights. But if Karen's here, are there any pressing questions about just the brigades and how they work and what to expect?
None about that, but one thing that you could maybe reiterate that a couple people have asked about the amphibians being safe to touch and handle, that they aren't, poisonous or harmful to the humans.
Yes, that's a great question. Amphibians do have toxins, but they would only be released if you ate them. So as long as you're not eating any newts, or licking any salamanders, which I don't advise you do, they are perfectly safe for you to come into contact with. There's lots of rumors about toads giving you warts, and newts being toxic, but it's not toxic to the touch. I would just recommend you wash your hands with soap and water before you head out in the field and after you get home from the field, because if you've touched a lot of amphibians, yeah, you might have some goo on your hands. Some of them do secrete a defensive goo that is very acrid tasting, and that could make, some predator sick to their stomach. But as long as you're not eating them and you're washing your hands after you're handling them, it is safe for you. All right, so I've talked a bit about crossing sites. I want to talk about this a little bit more, and I also just want to take this opportunity to show you how to find out about crossing sites. So this is a screenshot of a map. These yellow salamander sites are the ones that are kind of like the big 10 sites that we organize in the Monadnock region. And if you're new to this and you live in this area and you want to be at sites with other people where there are likely to be other amphibians, these are great places to start. We have detailed information about parking. There's likely to be a site coordinator there. But over the years, as this project grew and grew, I started to hear from people who would say, hey, Brett, I live on the seacoast, but I don't mind traveling to Keene to see salamanders. Like, I'll come out for a big night. And I started to think, well, this doesn't work, because how many amphibians are you accidentally running over on your way to Keene to see other amphibians and help them? And also, the weather in Keene and the weather on the seacoast are very different, and the weather changes, and you could have driven 2 hours only to arrive and find out that the rain never showed up. And so what I started to encourage people to do was to find crossings close to home, drive as little as possible. And so all of these green frogs are what we're called anecdotal crossings. These are crossings that have been reported to us from all over New Hampshire. And the goal here is to help you find a place that's close to home. Even if we're not actively reporting on data from sites because they're outside of our region, we do still, want to be able to find places that are close to home. And so I'm going to actually change my screen share to just show you how to find this on the Harris Center website. Because this is important, and there's some other information too. So if you go to our website, you go to Programs in Education, Community Science, Salamander Crossing Brigades. This is where a lot of this information lives. I know Karen's been sharing some links. So you can go to crossing sites here, and this is where that map is. My internet doesn't like it right now. It's taken a while, but you can click on any of these and you can get information. Whatever information we have about that site is there. And some of this information is pretty limited. It might just be that someone said, hey, Brett, I saw a salamander there once, and I put it on the map. If you have sites that are not on this map, but you know where there's amphibian crossings, we'd love to add them. So feel free to report them to us. And then also, if you scroll down, you can download parking and more detailed information for any of our well-established sites in the region. I also want to point out this over here. This is where the Salamander Forecast lives. Here's this forecast. This is also where we have a list of other crossing brigade programs. So if you don't live in Southwest New Hampshire, there may be people doing this closer to home for you, and everyone that we know about is listed by state on this website. So I really encourage you to spend a little time, and then the volunteer materials page is also really key, because this is where our volunteer handbook is. And all of that you get to from under here, Programs in Education, Salamander Crossing Brigades. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to the last parts of our presentation here. So what if there is no crossings near you? I know we're getting close to time, but I'm going to go through this sort of quickly. So this is for those of you who don't live in the Monadnock region. It's time for a road survey. It's time to go out on a migration night and look for crossings. So you're going to do just what everyone else is doing. You're going to watch the weather. You're looking for these things, 40-degree nighttime rain. You're going to think about places in your town where there are wetlands near roads, and especially where there's a wooded hillside on one side of the road and a body of water on the other. That is prime crossing site. You can also look at iNaturalist, which is a community science platform for people sharing observations of all kinds of species. You can look for search for spotted salamanders in your town, or wood frogs, and look for crossings, look for those species near roads. Bring a friend with you, because you're going to be driving, and you're going to want one of you to be driving and one of you to be looking and listening for amphibians. Anytime you're approaching a body of water or a suspected crossing site, drive slowly, less than 15 miles an hour. Put your blinkers on, take your time. And then you're going to be scanning the road. Oh, one other thing, roll your windows down and listen for wood frogs and peepers, because that could be the first sign that you're nearing a crossing. then you're going to be scanning the road. And what are you looking for? You're looking for little upturned rocks, little pyramid shaped rocks. Those are frogs, or sticks with one end pointed up. Those are salamanders. And maybe you're looking not just for live animals, but for dead animals as well, because they stay on the road a lot longer. So if you are able to, I encourage you to park safely. Don't park in people's driveways. That will freak them out. Pull well off the road. And then we've got these data sheets you can download, spend some time there, spend half an hour, see how many critters you find. And then if you find enough critters that it seems like a promising crossing site, you can collect all this other detailed location information that would help other people find your site again. So one side of the data form is for kind of weather conditions and site information, and the other side is your counts. And we use these little tally marks. This is true for all of our crossing sites, these little tick marks to help us keep track over time. So we're tight on time. So I'm just going to say a few of our sites, we also have a special project that is looking at spot patterns. So each spotted salamander as an adult has a unique spot pattern for that individual. It's kind of like a fingerprint. And so by taking pictures of them, we can tell if we've crossed the same individual salamander year after year, remembering that they can live more than 20 years. So this is just an example of a salamander we caught on its inbound migration and its outbound migration at North Lincoln Street in Keene. And here's what we're looking for. These are the same spots, same constellation of markings. Just to show you it wasn't a one-time deal. This is another one. So we have found more than 35 individual salamanders on at least 2 different occasions at North Lincoln Street. We've got some that have been counted in multiple years. We have one individual that we moved in 5 years in a row, which is really exciting for us. So if you want to contribute to this project, a few things to keep in mind. Spotted salamanders only. We love to see and share photos of all kinds of amphibians, and you're welcome to send photos to us to be shared with the whole group. But for this project, only spotted salamanders have the unique markings, and only at our 5 well-established crossings. This is because the value lies in going back to the same place year after year, and it's also we can't manage data from every single site. So we had to focus on Jordan Road, North Lincoln Street, Swansea Lake Road, Matthews Road, and Nelson Road. This information is available on our website and in our handbook. You want to photograph, you want us to be able to see their spot pattern clearly. So photographing their head and back from above, not a side shot. We want to see their whole body. So photographs like the one on the right. Ideally just 1 photo per salamander so that we don't have to sort through them and figure out if it's repeats. And then we really want to know the date, the site. And if you're really fancy about it, you can rename the photo file so that it includes a unique number. So if you found 3 salamanders, the first one is 01, the second one's 02, the third one's 03. We do have on our online photo submission form the ability to add some other information as well. So even if you don't rename the file, if that sounds like gobbledygook to you, you can still send us your pictures and we can still use them. So the last part of this is I like to talk about like why this project matters, what we can accomplish with it. And every year I hear from people who say, Brett, how are the salamanders doing? How's the population doing? How does this site compare to this other site? And that is not a question that we can answer with data from this project. And the reason for that is that our data collection varies really widely. So if we have a year when it only rains at 2 a.m., we probably have very few people out counting and crossing salamanders at 2 a.m. And so we'll have very low numbers for that year, even if the migration itself was the same as every other year. And also we have a lot of variability. So we might have 25 people at one crossing site and 2 people at another. And it stands to reason that even if there were the exact same number of salamanders, 25 people would just encounter more of them. And so there's a lot of things that we can't say about the data, including how long-term salamander populations are doing. If we really wanted to do that, we'd do what we're seeing here, which is put up what's called a pitfall array, where we surround a vernal pool or a road crossing with a fence and dig in these little buckets along the way so that every amphibian that tried to cross into the vernal pool would hit the fence, walk along until they fell in a bucket. And then a highly caffeinated graduate student would be out there counting them and removing them from those buckets and measuring them. And that's how we could really know from year to year or site to site how they're doing. But the numbers matter, the counts matter. And here's my example of that. In 2008, this is our North Lincoln Street crossing site. It looks really different today. But this is a site where we've got a 1/10 of a mile wide crossing. We've got we've got mostly frogs there crossing into this property. And in 2008, the property was cleared, and this for sale sign came up, and it turns out that there was a proposal to put several houses on this property, and it came before the Keene Conservation Commission because this property is adjacent to a wetland, and that's their purview to review. And they had heard about our project. It was really just the first few years of the project, and they said, Brett, how does this site compare to other sites? Is this an important site for amphibians? You know, what can you tell us? And I said, well, I can't tell you how it compares for all the reasons I've just shared with you guys, but I can tell you that in 4 hours, 20 volunteers moved 838 frogs across the road, and they were all going onto that property. Numbers tell a story that words can't tell. If I had said there's a lot of frogs, what's a lot? Is it 10? Is it 100? Is it 1,000? But to be able to say 838 frogs in 4 hours, and by the way, 20 people who care so much about those frogs that they're putting their own comfort aside to be out in the rain, that says something. And in this case, the city of Keene not only denied the permit, but they protected this land as conservation land because of its importance as a migratory amphibian pathway. In 2018, we took it a step further, and the city of Keene became the first community in all of New Hampshire to close a road for big nights to protect the amphibians. They work closely with us in order to do that. And this year, we're really excited to expand that to Jordan Road as well. None of this happens without the data. None of this happens without you going out there and seeing what you can find, recording it, and sharing it with us to share with them. We've also crossed more than 60,000 amphibians between 2007 and 2021, which is incredible. So I know we're running tight on time. I do have to leave you with a few homework assignments before I can let you go. The first is to go find the volunteer handbook on our website and read it. If there's anything important I forgot tonight, it will be in there. Watch the Nature Minute video. It's 7 minutes long. It shows you a great sense of what it's like to be out there on a big night if you've never been out. Gather your field gear, your reflective vest, your flashlight, because our next migration could be as soon as this weekend. Sign up for our email list. We used to automatically sign people up if they attended this training, but because so many of you are joining us from places that are far afield, or maybe just wanted to learn about the migration, it might not make sense for you to want to join our mailing list. If you live in Connecticut or Ohio or Ontario, you might not want to hear about the migrations in Southwest New Hampshire. So those of you who do want to hear about the migrations, sign up for our email list on our website, and so that we can keep you posted. We also have a liability waiver that I have to encourage you to sign. It's not exciting, but it's important for us. So we're a little bit over time, but I can stay a few extra minutes if there are pressing questions. So thank you all for joining us. I hope I've inspired you to get out there and see some salamanders and frogs. And are there any big questions left to be answered, Karen?
One, I've handled a couple in the chat, but one that I thought you could really speak to was folks asked about setting up their own brigades in other areas. Do you have any tips for people that want to start their own crossing programs?
Yes, I first of all, I strongly support this. Get your friends and neighbors together, find some crossing sites. I would encourage you to start small. Find a site, one site in town. You know, the Harris Center is helping coordinate efforts at dozens of sites, really, but you only need one to get started, and it's way more manageable that way. You're welcome to use any of our materials on our website to help train people. And if you want, you know, an offline version that's not PDF, so that you can swap out, you know, your local sites and places for ours, we're happy to provide that for you. We really strongly encourage these efforts. And I also would encourage you, you know, to check out our list of other Crossing Brigades programs. Those run the gamut from really well-established programs like ours with lots of materials and support to individuals in specific towns who are just looking for people to go out with them on big nights. And if you want to be one of those people who has your name on that list, you know, drop me a line, because you'd be amazed how many people find their way to us from all over the place. They're looking to connect with people to do this work together. And we're happy to kind of play matchmaker and to provide as much support as we can. But I guess my advice would be to pick one site, find one or two sites in your town and a small group of neighbors to get going. And you don't need a sign. You just need a reflective vest and a flashlight and some friends out there with you.
One thing that a couple people have asked about that I've written about, but I think it always bears repeating, is people are asking about, like, what time should I go out? When is the best time to go out? So just sort of like reiterating the mantra of, the weather conditions and what makes it right.
Yes. And also I meant to say, I'm really glad that question is asked, because I meant to say and forgot to say that we typically are out from around sundown until 10 or 11 at night. But of course, you are welcome to stay as little or as long as you like. Some people go out for an hour and some people stay out until 2 or 3 a.m. The amphibians will migrate all night long as conditions are right. But if the temperature drops below 40 or the ground dries up because the rain stopped, the migration will slow too. So, in terms of when to go out, you're looking for these weather conditions, and then you can stay, and it usually takes them a little bit of time after dark to get going. They don't like hit the ground running right at sundown. But you can stay as long as you like, but know that the amphibians will be there unless it gets too cold or too dry for them. And most of our volunteers tend to come out around 7:30 or 8 and stay till around 10 or 10:30. So thanks everyone for your attention, and good night.
Thank you very much.